So welcome to all of you. My name is Sean Gilsdorf. I'm the co-chair of the program committee for the centennial meeting of the Medieval Academy. And on behalf of the program committee and my co-chair, Professor Eileen Sweeney, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this centennial meeting of the MAA. This is a homecoming of sorts. The Medieval Academy's founding documents were signed not far from Harvard Yard, and its first meeting in 1926, overseen by Harvard classicist E.K. Rand, took place just across and down the river at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Newbury Street building. 50 years later, the MAA celebrated its golden anniversary meeting on Harvard's campus with a rather modest program made up of disciplinary state-of-the-field workshops, 2 paper sessions, and 4 plenary talks dealing with the history, literature, and arts of Latin and Greek Christendom. As it returns to Harvard Yard, however, both the Medieval Academy and medieval studies have changed in profound ways, a change that can be seen both in the places, questions, and perspectives that define this year's program, and in the faces, identities, and concerns of those participating in it. We're excited by the conversations that will take place in the coming days, and we're eager to begin them. Before we do so, though, I'd like to acknowledge those who've made this centennial meeting a reality. First, our many generous sponsors across the Boston area and beyond who've contributed their expertise, their time, their energy, and not least, their money. Our brilliant program committee, an interdisciplinary group of colleagues from Boston College, Boston University, Brandeis University, Fitchburg State University, MIT, Stonehill College, Tufts University, Wellesley College, and Harvard University, who dedicated many, many hours to the hard work of bringing disparate disciplines, geographies, and theoretical perspectives into a coherent and compelling whole. To our friends and confrères at the Medieval Academy for all of their hard work and support, Cheryl Mullane-Corvey, Chris Cole, Lisa Fagan-Davis, and Sarah Lipton. To Anna Wilson, Eileen Sweeney, and Chelsea Parsons, the brain trust who made Wednesday's graduate pedagogy workshop on teaching in the global Middle Ages at Boston College such a rewarding and transformative event. Our hardy band of dedicated volunteers, the Centenarii in the blue shirts, who keep the machine purring. Our unbelievable local organizing team, who prove that alchemy is indeed a true science. Reed Morgan, Magister Librorum, Sam Popolo, who makes the wheels on the bus go round and round, Lorena Alessandrini, also known as Why You Have PowerPoints, Rachel Teubner and Brian Fitzgerald, the driving force behind our workshops and concerts, Anna Sue, who's queen of the 100 folk, Dolan Wells Gallagher, keeping the sessions on track, on time, and in sync, Adan Ramirez Figueroa, cruise director extraordinaire, and Andy Chen, Protosecretis kai Protonotarios, keeper of the sacred Barker tables. 2 other individuals deserve special mention. The first is Nicholas Watson, who from the very first supported our efforts to host the centennial meeting, worked tirelessly on the proposal we presented to the council, and wrote literally hundreds of letters and emails and called in many favors besides to secure the funding required to put on an event of this scope. None of this would have happened without him. The second is our local events chair, Dr. Claire Adams, whose savvy, intelligence, dedication, and saucy good humor have kept the keel straight and the sails full, whatever the storms that faced us. Please join me in thanking Nicholas, Claire, and the rest of our merry band for their Herculean efforts. Just as importantly, our thanks to all of you for contributing to this wonderful and wondrous celebration. And I'm now honored to welcome my friend and colleague, Lisa Fagan-Davis, Executive Director of the Medieval Academy of America, to the lectern for a few words of welcome.
Oh my goodness. I think in Sean's merry band, my role in this scenario is head cheerleader. Well, wow, look at this. Welcome, everyone, to the 100th annual meeting. I'm a little emotional all of a sudden. We've been working towards this for a decade, and so it is such a joy to be here with all of you. I am so pleased that you're here and here in Cambridge. And I want to express my absolute utmost thanks to Sean, who didn't thank himself, so I am going to thank him. This meeting, as you may have noticed, this meeting is extremely complicated. Lots of moving parts, and Sean and the rest of the team have done such an extraordinary job of organizing and implementing it. Shout out to Sean, Eileen Sweeney, Claire Adams, all of our hosts and sponsors, the entire team of volunteers. If you see someone in a blue shirt, thank them, because you have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. And my staff, Chris Cole, who you will see at registration, Cheryl Mullane Corvey behind the scenes for pulling off this extraordinary and complicated meeting. And I want to thank all of you for making the journey from around the world to be here with us this week. And I want to give a special shout out to our Canadian colleagues. I know it was a difficult decision for some of you to travel to the US. I don't blame you for that. Elbows up. During these dark and difficult days, it is more important than ever to convene and collaborate, to celebrate each other and to learn from each other. I am very much looking forward to the next few days. If you and I don't know one another, please introduce yourself to me at a coffee break or a reception or in the hallway. Tell me about your research. Tell me about what's happening in your state, at your job, in your department, on your campus. The more I know about what's happening out there, the more I can do working with our governance and our volunteer corps to help. Supporting you and advocating for medieval studies is my job. It's our job. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to celebrating with you. One piece of housekeeping before I hand things over to our next kiosk holder. When you registered for this meeting, you may remember that you were asked to check a box agreeing to abide by our professional behavior policy. Thank you for that. It is printed in your program on pages 3 through 5 if you need a reminder about what professional behavior entails. Should you feel that someone in one of your sessions or at a reception or anywhere has violated that policy, please immediately go to the Barker Center and inform someone. They will inform me, and I will take it from there. There are a group of advocates for considerations of violations of the policy. And I will convene the advocates as quickly as we can convene to discuss the situation. The advocates are myself, Lauren Lee from the Graduate Student Committee. There she is over there. Thank you, Lauren. Mike Ryan from the Council. Mike, are you here somewhere? Mike Ryan from the Council, and Anna Wilson, who is somewhere too. There's Anna Wilson for the Program Committee. I would ask you please to not try to solve the problem or engage with someone yourself who is disrupting. Please, please, please follow the procedure so that we can make sure that everyone is safe and that everyone is comfortable in our meeting. So now I will hand things over to our incredible president who is wrapping up her presidential year in 48 hours, Sarah Lipton.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Sean. I will be repeating all these thank yous many times, but right now, all I want to do is take 2 minutes to take the enormous pleasure of welcoming you all to the 100th annual meeting of the Medieval Academy of America. Given the fact that many of us cover 1,000 years or more in our studies or teaching and deal with sources that can sometimes barely be dated to within a century or two, Part of me has been tempted over the past years to imitate Austin Powers and say satirically, 100 years. But it actually is really a very big deal. For a group of scholars dedicated to studying the very distant past, to have survived, to have grown in a country, dare I say a continent, that fetishizes the future and often seems to consider the 19th century ancient history, is a real achievement. I hope you all enjoy this meeting. I have to confess that I did not enjoy my first MAA annual meeting. I was a terrified graduate student. I didn't know a soul, and so far as I can recall, no one spoke to me the entire time. So I encourage all of you to reach out to your fellow medievalists. Catch up with your friends by all means. That's why a lot of us are here. But also, please, say hello to those you don't know. Share reactions to papers with the people sitting in the room with you or the people you see at meals. Maybe invite a lone diner to join you. And please, if any of you don't know me and would like to say hello, feel free. 5 years after the onset of COVID, almost to the day, it still feels like a rare and, given financial pressures, maybe endangered treat for us to be able to gather like this. It's reason to celebrate, and I hope that's what you all do over the next few days. Okay, I am now authorized to present the paper prizes. I just segue right into that? Is that what I do, Lisa? Excellent. This is really the fun part for all of us. There will be more prizes awarded at the presidential plenary on Saturday morning, but at the moment we are giving the prizes for papers presented here at the Medieval Academy meeting. The first paper that I am going to present is by Drew Narayanan. Sorry, I practiced and I'm speaking too fast. Drew Narayanan, who is giving a paper entitled, "Is That Burning Love or Is That Hellfire? Sultan, Saint, Race, and Conversion in 14th and 15th Century Trial by Fire Scenes," to be presented in session 54, Friday at 1:30 p.m. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to catch that. Drew, please come on up. And I should have mentioned that was the prize for the Inclusivity and Diversity Travel Grant, enabling Drew to come and present his paper here. Now, the prize for the Best Student Paper Prize goes to Cecily Hughes of Case Western Reserve University for a paper entitled "A Place to Shine, Darkness and Light in a Medieval Swedish Sacrament Niche," to be presented in session 34, Friday at 8:30 a.m. And I think a prize-winning paper is worth getting up for in the morning. So I hope that the session is full. Cecily, please come on up. Congratulations. It is now my pleasure and privilege to introduce Robin Fleming, whom I introduced last year at the presidential plenary before she gave her presidential address. And I was told this time, not elaborate, keep it short. So I will simply say that Robin is a professor of Roman, early medieval history, and historical archaeology at Boston College. She is a noted expert on many things, but I have to say, one of my favorites, early medieval dogs. And among her many, many, many accolades, which I'm not supposed to list, I really feel like I do have to say in 2012, she was a MacArthur Genius Award Fellow. And Robin is going to introduce our plenary speaker.
I live in Cambridge, and I've been in Sanders Theatre a lot. I never imagined I'd be on stage, so this is a big moment for me. It's a great pleasure to introduce Kristina Robinson. Richardson, sorry, the first of this year's plenary speakers. She holds an impressive title. It's a real mouthful. It's 32 words, I counted. So she's the John L. Now II Professor of History of Principles of Democracy, as well as the Professor of History and Professor of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Culture at the University of Virginia. Her extra-long official title reflects the remarkable breadth of her work, which spans an impressive number of time periods, geographic regions, and disciplines. One notable aspect of her scholarship, not truly indicated, I think, in her professorial title, is her focus on ordinary and marginalized people rather than elites. For example, her first book, Difference and Disability in the Medieval Islamic World, Blighted Bodies, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2012, explores the concepts of the disabled body in Mamluk Cairo, Damascus, and Mecca, and presents us with a study of the cultural construction of difference and disability in the Islamic world. Another of her books is a co-edited edition and commentary of an Ottoman period text written not by a scholar, but by a weaver merchant, introducing us to a person who believed himself entitled, despite his social position, to comment on the happenings of his day, and pushing back into the late 16th century examples of texts written by people situated at the margins of elite circles. Her most recent monograph, Roma in the Medieval Islamic West, which was published in 2022, is a brilliant investigation of the Banu Sana, a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional group. She shows that contrary to popular stereotypes of them as tricksters and beggars, diviners and itinerants, although some were, that many members of this group were also sedentary, literate individuals who served as important culture brokers. She excavates their role in literary culture and uncovers their household structures, housing, and neighborhoods. These findings would be significant on their own, but she goes on to do more and uncovers the way members of the group played a central role in medieval Islamic book culture, book illumination, and the use and spread of block printing technology. The scholarship presented in this book is extraordinary, and it's little wonder that she won the Medieval Academy of America's 2023 Monica H. Green Prize for Distinguished Medieval Research, in addition to her receiving the prestigious, no-strings-attached Dan David Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in 2022. Today, we will be treated to some of the work that I think has probably been made possible by that prize. She'll be speaking to us about Breaking New Grounds, East African People and Plants in the Early Islamic Medieval East. Please welcome Kristina Richardson.
Thank you so much for being here. This is my first time at the, is this okay, the sound? Okay. My first time not only at this theater, but speaking at Harvard University. So this is very new for me. So thank you so much, Robin, for that generous introduction. And I'm so happy, honored to be here speaking in front of all of you. Now, I know a centenary year is a rich moment to reflect on time and to gather and to think about ritual time, the seasons in the life of an institution, in our own careers, and especially in an institution as august as the Medieval Academy of America. And plus, it's the first day of spring, it's the vernal equinox, and to those celebrating the Persian New Year, Nowruz Mubarak. So today my talk will be a bit of an associative lecture. It'll be a talk in four equatorial seasons, and none of which will be too familiar to any of us in Cambridge. These are ocean-made seasons. And the ocean exists within a spectrum of temporal cycles, tides, monsoons, and moons. And at the equator, where my talk begins and kind of ends, things seem to bifurcate, not just the globe into two halves, but the lengths of a day and night are pretty much the same. The sun rises around 6:20 every morning and sets at 6:20 every evening, pretty much year-round. There are only two distinct weather patterns. There are dry seasons and wet seasons. And each one, though, occurs twice each year. A short dry period, a season of heavy rains, a long dry period, and a season of short rains. So that will divide the talk. But I particularly want to intervene today in discussions around the global Middle Ages and perhaps race, maybe ethnicity. I won't talk too much about that, but just to say that in this new field that I seem to be moving into, which has emerged from literary studies, just to encourage us historians and archaeologists and art historians to engage with this work, to concretize our discussions of the people we're talking about, and to think about their home regions. And also to think about, again, other previous eras, like this example of a Byzantine Turkish mosaic floor. You can see a dark-skinned man leading a zebra that's only an East African animal. And also, for instance, in Gaza of the 6th century, so pre-Islamic artifact. But just to say that these are not new communications and contacts I'm discussing, but long-term, and I'm just looking at one facet of a long history of this engagement. And as you can see from this floor, this mosaic floor in a synagogue in Gaza, that Timotheus of Gaza is saying, you know, this from the same period, he lived in the same period as the floor, that it was such a spectacular moment when giraffes and elephants had come to Gaza, and maybe also zebras, so, etc. So I've gotten 2 pieces of really excellent advice throughout my career. And the first was from my dissertation advisor, Catherine Babayan, who said that when you're stuck, to reread your notes and your sources, but to do it as though it's the first time. So as I age, I no longer have to fake forgetfulness. When I go to my home office, I really don't. I'm shocked sometimes by notes I've taken. But it's just going to renew your attachment, renew your gaze. But the second, and I'll come back to that, but in the second piece I got is actually more recent, from actually a woman named Nicole Wade. And she's a curator at the Kluge-Ruhr Museum in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I work. I work at the university, she works at the Museum of Aboriginal Australian Art. And she was showing me some pieces in the collection and discussing curation and storage. And she mentioned that she treats every object as if it were a living human being. So ascribing it a particular dignity, which sounds like an easy transition to make, but I promise when you try to do that, it shapes and reshapes your approach. And these 2 comments have shaped and continually reshaped my approach to histories of all kinds of people, enslaved, bonded, usually low-status workers, and often re-asking what will be my intellectual entry point to these communities and lives. So as I begun to think about movements, and that's what we'll talk about today, of hypothetical East African people, I'll try to construct 4 seasons of a hypothetical life who've been captured and transported across the Indian Ocean for sale. I just want us to think about what might have been happening in these seasons. So I've already mentioned the season of heavy rains, during which most likely individuals on the East African mainland would have just been awaiting transfer. And I will start with the second season up there. A spectacular rainbow season that comes after, sorry. Hope you can still hear me? Oh, okay. A spectacular rainbow season, which is not a real season, but it's the very early part of the dry season where there's the sun and the mist, and it just creates a beautiful mix for rainbows. A season of light rains during which the East Africans would have been transported across the ocean, and then a short dry period in the Middle East, and we'll talk about maybe attempts to kind of remake lives and maybe escape those lives. So a period of fugitivity. So I know this is not an instinctual calendar again, but these seasons structure rhythms of commerce, of warfare, irrigation, pastoralism. So I'm going to start with these heavy rains. So this was, from inside a car. I did not go outside during the heavy rains. I'm too American, I guess. So classical sources refer to the coast stretching from Mogadishu in Somalia to Sofala as Bilad Azanj. And until recently, we haven't known of any kinship groups within that enormous swath of land. So historians still speak of them in this undifferentiated way as the Zanj. Now, a 9th century witness, I think I can walk while I talk. Okay, good. So a 9th century witness, Al-Jahiz of Basra, actually referred to 2 types of people that he saw in, maybe I should go back to the map, but to lower Iraq, so Basra, as you can see down there. And he referred to individuals, some of them whom filed their teeth to sharp points, and others extracted their lower teeth. I won't go into too much detail about that. I have been able to figure out, and some of you have heard me speak about it, but that the geographical origin of the teeth filers is probably somewhere around on the map between Zanzibar and Kilwa. Their name in the classical material is Mejkwe, but they are ancestral to a modern kinship group, and you can see the filed teeth in both photos, both images, in southern Tanzania and northern Mozambique. But so a longue durée history of a single group. But let's actually get back to these people who actually extracted their teeth. So in the anecdote on the screen, which I think you can easily read, you can see that this is an anecdote from Basra, that there's a Zanji man, an East African worker in the fields, is asked about these things. And the response from the Zanji worker to why do some Zanj pull their front teeth out and why do others sharpen them, he says that the people who remove their teeth do it to avoid the appearance of sheep. So sheep have an upper gum pad, and prominent lower front teeth. And in another work, we know what these people who remove their teeth did. I'll get to that in a moment. But the philosopher Samantha Weiss has argued that basing human beauty on animal features may speak to a certain ethic around the animal or around the human relationship to said animal. The example of, for instance, aquiline noses as a mark of European royalty dovetails with veneration of the eagle, as symbolic of majestic strength. And similarly, among the teeth extractors, this anti-sheep aesthetic could be tied to a pastoralist lifestyle, distinguishing themselves from sheep, the animals over which they have dominion. So this is obviously a drawing, but of a pastoralist group in East Africa that still engages in the practice of removing the lower teeth. And this might be harder to see at right, just because of the saturation of color. But what we should be seeing here is a Maasai gentleman, who I just ran into. But we spoke about the tradition, which I'd also been reading about, of a pastoralist community. So the Maasai of Kenya, are pastors of sheep and cattle, and remove their lower teeth so as not to, as you can see, look like other animals, look like donkeys, which they don't quite enjoy. So we know from other 9th century sources that individuals in Basra who were removing their teeth worked as eunuchs. They worked in agrarian contexts and otherwise. But it's not just, and also there's sources saying that they ride bulls, right? And so you can see, I think at left on this image, I won't push that. But you can see it left on this image, a dark-skinned man riding a bull who's supposedly coming from East Africa. So an identification with cattle and sheep in different ways we do see. Chinese sources also document contact with East African pastoralists. As you can see on the screen, in the 9th century, the Chinese scholar Tuan Qingxi claimed that in the country of the Popali, which we know is Eastern Africa, the people do not eat any of the 5 grains, they eat only meat. They often stick a needle into the veins of cattle and draw blood, which they drink raw, mixed with milk. The Maasai still do that today. I'm not saying that the Maasai are who is being referred to here, but just that they're probably pastoralist traditions that are rather old. And as we can also see from this anecdote, they were involved with the slave trade. The paragraph continues to say that the Arabs, they don't say from where, but presumably from the Gulf area, that the Arabs frequently raid and steal individuals and sell them into slavery. So, by triangulating a range of sources, so Chinese, Arabic, images, and also descriptions of bodies, we can probably surmise that extracting teeth may have been a practice of pastoralists. So we know in Basra, at least a pastoralist population, I don't know their name, and a sharpened teeth population. Their name is the Meshkua. And so we know a little bit more about who's actually existing in these spaces. And so how did we get there? Just very quickly. This is a map actually of teeth sharpening and teeth removal, actually, where you can find this on the East African continent. I'll zoom in on the right map, but just to say the yellow is the yellow is removal, the purple is sharpening. And so you can see around the island that I'm going to focus on in this next section, Pimba Island, that you have the reasonable expectation that perhaps the people coming from East Africa, brought to Pemba and then sold to Arabs and Persians, were coming from perhaps the highlighted areas. And you can see in purple the word Meshkua is starting from the bottom and moving up. Or Makua, sorry, the modern moving up. So we have a sense also now of where they're coming from, and that's pretty new. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Pemba. So Pemba Island, I visited there for the first time last year, making my way to 3 early sites. And the island is a significant, if non-canonical, early Islamic site off the northern coast of Tanzania and 50 miles north of Zanzibar. To get there, you fly to Zanzibar City. In case you try to do this, do not take the boat. You will vomit for days. So fly the little plane. I did go by plane, but that was also scary. So anyway, it's a ride. I think I lifted my arm and then the plane tipped, and I was like, I got it. I can't do this. This is too much. But anyway, I made it. Okay, so it's home in the north to a major port that was used by merchants who were sailing on the monsoon trade winds. And so, as I mentioned, most of the Zenji slaves came from the mainland interior, brought to this port of today it's Tumba, medieval word is Konbalu, in anticipation of the merchants' arrivals with the monsoon winds. So they were timing all of this. It's timed with the winds. And it's actually a site that has been excavated by my brilliant colleague, Adria Laviolette, an archaeologist who specializes in Iron Age Swahili coast. Now, the interesting thing is that Tumba, sorry, I meant to go a little further. You can see what it kind of looks like. The site is on a bluff, and it overlooks something called the Michiweni Bay. It has been excavated. She started in the late 1990s, and others have taken up the work. What they have found is that the site ended in 950. I mean, it was abandoned or collapsed. And a lot of the structures show signs of having been burned. In fact, she and her team found a 350-gram mass of molten lead next to a burned post. And its shape, they say, suggested that it had melted around the post as it burned. And if lead was used for net weights, which it probably was, then this large piece may represent the melted remains of weights dangling from a net draped over the rafters. Regardless of the lead's function, the fact that it melted in situ suggests the intensity of the fire and that relatively uncommon imported goods, because lead is not from Pemba, were left to burn. Coincidentally, the Arabic and Persian sources do say that in the year 945, this port was attacked. They said, the Arabic sources say they weren't able to conquer it. So reading those two together, it's very likely that there was a large attack, they couldn't subdue everybody, and maybe everyone, but most people fled to new settlements. So it died pretty quickly. But even so, we have remnants from the site that suggest very much that it was a place where people were housed, meaning not in individual homes, but in a large structure. So on the promontory overlooking the harbor are the collapsed, burned remains of a daub structure that dates to the 8th to 10th centuries. It's about 3,300 square feet. It's the largest structure found on the site. And we are probably more familiar with barracoons in North America, but this structure that probably housed slaves is something that we should maybe pay a bit more attention to. And also outside of it were evidence of a lot of craft production. So even as they were waiting, perhaps these slaves were put to work. Sorry. So this work has been a thrilling and satisfying history to excavate and reconstruct. And I'll just say how it came about, what influenced looking at Pemba, of all places. So in my work on the Roma, there's a poem that says, "Among our number are the Zanj." And I wondered, why would traveling peoples be bothered with East Africans, most of whom were enslaved, if not enslaved, if they were freed, they were still attached to their owners usually, and very low status. But one band of strangers claimed that he would dye the skin of young slave boys, pale-skinned boys, and any wanted people who wished to flee. So this is something else. So there were also Circassian, Caucasian, like Ukrainian and Russian slaves in the Middle East. So they would put something, I have the recipes, but they don't make a lot of sense to me. So they'd put something on darken their skin, and then they could move easily with them. Everyone would presume they were African slaves. And they would, as travelers and professional travelers on the road, able to get them out of the territory. How Zanj probably fit into this, and they say in their recipes how to make a white person into a black Zanj. So this is not, this is exactly what they're doing. That they probably also had a sort of underground railroad effect where you could kind of abscond with Zanj. They claim that they paid them, that they would pay to take this journey. And so they probably passed as slaves of these travelers, and why not? But the difficult question becomes, for the paler-skinned individuals who kind of knew where they would go, they could pretty much go anywhere in North Africa, Eastern Mediterranean, and claim to be free. But for the Zanj, where could they be free other than their homelands? So anywhere in the Islamic world, they'd still risk discovery. And discovery of a fugitive places his life at risk. There's a hadith of the Prophet that states the slave who fled from his master committed an act of infidelity as long as he would not return. So to be a fugitive means you're an infidel, meaning you're outside of the protection of Islam, and you're basically subject to death. So it is a declaration of war against slaves. And even one of the hadith transmitters of this particular hadith, who's in Basra, where there's a large concentration of slaves, says, "By God, this hadith was narrated from the apostle, but I do not like that this should be narrated on my authority here in Basra." So the idea being that he did not want to be associated maybe with something that might encourage individuals to move against him. So at this point, in our little calendar, the Zanj are in the Middle East. So in this season, of light rains. And as I've said, some of the people we spoke about, especially the teeth extractors, I told you that they were eunuchs. They were also, Arabs complained that they lisped because of their missing teeth. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but just to say what that means, and I used to work on disability, so this is also a question I got interested in, but lisping threatens the integrity of your prayers. You're saying different. If you're lisping and you say perthen instead of person, you're not, of course, in Arabic, but you're saying something else. And so you can't be a leader in the community. You can't maybe even authentically pray to God. So, and recite the Quran in front of others and have them, right? So you're cut off from the Islamic cultural establishment where community was paramount. So we see ways in which, and there's a lot of writing about lisping for various reasons, but I wonder if one of it is because of the eunuchs with the missing teeth. But in addition to that, in addition to working as eunuchs, they also worked, as I have here, in outdoor occupations. These were all of the Zanj. They were working in plantations of date palms. They served as imperial household guards, these are the eunuchs, or they stood guard in front of homes, or along the perimeters and entrances of orchards and gardens. They also cared for animals, like a pastoralist would, and they worked in other agrarian contexts. This work is pretty invisibilized and yet obviously very common because the people in their histories have been made so. For instance, just to show you one quick one, how they were also distinguished, meaning once they've left East Africa in the season of the rains that take them north, they're stereotyped as people who are unclean and also as smelly. That's usually, if you search for the word Zanj and smell, you're going to find all of this. I don't have any examples on the screen, but it's pretty prominent. And in fact, you have even lots of explanations for that. And Iraqis mostly, who are the ones encountering these Zanji groups, talk about it, right? Unclean. It's not all slaves, just the slaves who do the outdoor work, the work that is for those who smell so bad. This is the point of the stereotype, that they're not fit for indoor work. They're not fit to be domestic servants. So domestic servants were northeast, like of the Horn, and of course, North Africa and other spaces. But East Africans worked outside. And the work they did sometimes tipped into the scientific. So even in this earlier 9th century text from Basra, Al-Jahiz was born in Basra, he talks about individuals. He uses the word fashkar, the same word he used for the man who talked about the teeth dental modifications. And this gentleman says that these peasant foremen, these Zanjis, they engage in a mysterious science that verify knowledge through experience. So the experimentation on plants, et cetera, et cetera. And we have actually, this is from a Dioscorides, I said that wrong, I know, but manuscript. And at left and at right, you can see groups of men, or couplets men, working on plants. At bottom right, it says in Arabic that they're basically tapping the balsam tree for sap. And there's another group of men here also working on balsam, it looks like. But anyway, so you see groups, and they're not dressed as enslaved people. They're wearing something on their head. That's the mark for a respectable person, and they have shoes on. And that's very distinguished from everything related to enslaved people. So there's something about their dignity. Some of them are actually dignified as scientists and as specialists in the land. And here's a close-up so you can see that. But the last season I want to talk about, and this is as they're in the Middle East and existing in various ways. The short dry period, there is no movement on the equator, excuse me. There are no winds to bring people there, Linsor, or there. So I want us to think a little bit about what's happening in the Middle East. So I have pictured here an African baobab, which is native to West Tropical Africa. And there are 6 other species endemic to Madagascar and to Australia. But contrary to statements you'll find on the Wikipedia page for the African baobab, it is not endemic to southern Arabia, like to Yemen or the Oman. So, and also to the Google AI summaries will also say that too, so be careful. So a fiction that obscures some pretty interesting history. So baobabs are said to be in countries as distant from the African continent as Vietnam and Indonesia. The slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade brought the baobab to Latin America, and they can be found in the Caribbean today. Maybe some of our Caribbeanists can explain. And some baobabs also enjoy the warm climate in Florida. I have a colleague who's trying to grow a baobab in Charlottesville. I don't know how that's gonna go, but all power to her. But they're known for their girth and their longevity. They're also known as the tree of life. Their fruits are citrusy and tart. You can buy the seeds on the roadside and they turn your fingers purple. My daughter loved that this summer. And their large white flowers hang down like bells and they only bloom at night. Bats pollinate them and the flowers smell, many people say, I didn't get a chance to smell it, like decaying flesh. I know, who'd have thought? You thought I'd say something else. But during the Bantu migration, eastward and south, so you can see in the west, that's where it started, and then as people moved, they brought and planted baobab seeds or saplings to mark new settlements. And so I only learned this summer when archaeologists work in East Africa, especially, they survey the land, of course, but they find an appropriately aged baobab, say around 1,000 years old, and they look for other evidence that there was an early settlement there. And if the tree is near the historical coastline, which has shifted over the centuries, but with the historical coastline, then the settlement probably encountered overseas traders. So if you're interested in India, China, or the Middle East, then those are the East African settlements to go to. But we know that the movements of East Africans and the carrying of the baobab did not stop on the coastline. As we talked about Latin America, Caribbean, Florida maybe. But we know that it also moved. So the baobab I showed you on this slide grows in the Omani village of Dalkut. It's near the border with Yemen, and I'll show you a map. It doesn't look quite 1,000 years old, but archaeologists such as my colleague in London, Seth Priestman, he's finding many sherds of East African cooking pots, actually at minor and major ports on the Arabian coastlines. Most date to the early Islamic period, meaning shortly after the Prophet Muhammad's death, around 632. So if archaeologists and historians who work around the Indian Ocean are serious about finding out about East African movements or even about possible settlements, then baobabs may be an indicator that at one time or another, East Africans intentionally planted seeds here and built a settlement around it. And as we're reading and interpreting landscapes, we can consider these trees living monuments and also as invitations to wonder and to, ignite our historical imagination. But if you sail from Dalkut about a day or two west towards into the Yemeni territories, you'll hit Ra'ish Sharma, which is a bluff. And atop this bluff Ras just means head, so the head of Sharma. So at the top is the medieval site of Sharma. And the French archaeologist Axel Rogeul has found that nearly all the cooking pots used in daily life there, or at least the potters who made them, were of East African origin. And you can see the characteristic at right incised decorations and often, I know it's small, but also a line of dots, and that's East African. And maybe just to make it a little bit bigger, so numbers 16 through 18. And these pieces are characteristic of 9th through 12th century sites in East Africa. And the potters also made large open basins, as you see in image 15. So these to store and serve food, and not water, that would be the jars. So Sharma had strong ties to East Africa, also to China, which I'm not talking about, but it was likely a merchant community who lived there and were active in the Indian Ocean trade. Were many of them East African? Were any fugitives, maroons, remaking their lives in shared exile? Could that underground railroad of travelers I mentioned have brought fugitive slaves to coastal communities where they could shelter or join crews and sail away? This is a later image, I understand, from Iraq. But just to show that here's a ship, very common image, but a ship captained by what looks to be a person of the Indian subcontinent, or the southern Indian Ocean, judging by his hairstyle and his mustache. He's also wearing very regal clothing, so he's a person of status, he's the captain. But you can also see that they're workers, laborers. I'm highlighting, I know it's fuzzy, but I'm highlighting the gentleman in the crow's nest with the wind sleeve, whose hair seems to suggest maybe he's of East African descent. But you can also see two dark-skinned men at the bottom, not wearing shirts, and dumping out water. These are sewn boats, meaning they leak. So your job, maybe you were enslaved, maybe you were free. Maybe you did that to get away. But anyway, to join crews seems to be very common for East African individuals. And everyone not wearing a shirt is, a laborer. We don't know their status. So we should feel free to imagine any number of possibilities, but first to imagine the possibility that the monuments of a people may not look like those of rich, settled societies, and their importance is not measured by how much they affect the rise and fall of sedentary polities. When we stop treating ourselves as the measure of everything, then we can revise our sense of historical significance. So civilization, or just maybe culture, may be etched onto one's bodies, as with tattoos, and you can hear more about medieval tattooing in Esther Lieberman-Cuenca's paper in session 27. Or that can be found, the filter can be found in dental modifications that I mentioned earlier. Specific tree species may be indication of an outside community settlement or a stopping place. And as we commemorate a century of medieval scholarship and work towards centuries more, let's endeavor to include the studies of people cut off from everything, usually, but their own bodies and the land, and maybe look to those spaces as potential archives, and to give ourselves what the anthropologist Manveer Singh has called, quote, the greatest gift that a more global history offers, greatness redefined. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. No, it's not. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I think it's right there. Sorry.
Thank you, Kristina. Thank you so much for this excellent, erudite, informative. I can go on talk. I learned so much. I'm just wondering, in your research, have you come across something regarding women? And, any remnants, whether like pieces of jewelry or perhaps clothing, just something that also tells us or informs us about presence of enslaved women?
You mean in East Africa or Oman?
Yeah, from East Africa to then, they're also their movement.
Sure.
Yeah.
As for artifacts, and let me say, I'm not an archaeologist, so I can't claim this, but what they have found, it won't sound exciting, but spindles, so evidence of weaving. That doesn't mean it was women necessarily. and we only have one piece of cloth that has been preserved, and it was preserved in chake in Pemba. So it's purple indigo dyed cloth from India, cotton from India. That's all we have in terms of textiles. The lives of women are pretty, I mean, in the text sources tell us a little bit more, that they were, for instance, I didn't talk about, it was in my notes, but I decided to skip it, but that in a city called Ma'amal in Arabia, that they brought in 200 Zanji men to plant trees, and they also brought in for them 200 Zanji women, right? So that they would not intermarry, one, but also that they be natural increase as well of the population. Women are unfortunately pretty hidden. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm keeping, those are some of the people I want to think about who maybe didn't leave traces, but it is much harder than the men, I have to admit. That's a great question, though. Thanks.
Hi, Kristina. This was wonderful. Can you tell us about what I might have missed this, but what they did with the sharpened teeth?
Okay. And I thought you were in Florence. Okay, I'm so sorry.
No, Inga's in Florence.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Our daughters know each other, so she's...
Yeah, I hear this through TikTok. Yeah. Sorry. Well, I'm glad you're here. Okay, with the sharpened teeth. It's a little controversial. I mean, from the Zanji informants writing in Arabic, they actually say that they use this for martial reasons, that in warfare, to show total dominance, that they will actually eat ceremonially human flesh. So that's in the Arabic sources. There's anthropologists and historians tend to read these stories as fictions that the Makua tell themselves to maybe ward off their enemies. So I don't know exactly how to tell it, but how to understand it. But I will say that that 19th century informants in East Africa who are working with the Makua, they repeat almost the exact same stories from the 9th century, which is incredible endurance, but like the teeth sharpening, maybe reflecting a very core cultural ritual, like circumcision that has endured over centuries. So these are pubescent rituals of teeth sharpening. And so the stories they talk about which parts of the body are actually ideal, and they're unusual, like the left hand, and it's in sources with 1,000 years. So I don't necessarily, are these stories that have just been is there any authenticity to it? I don't know, but that's what they say. The purpose is martial. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you for a great talk. Just a follow-up question on sharp teeth. Sorry, fangs are cool.
Of course.
I was curious about, do we have archaeological evidence for them at grave finds? I was thinking the graves that are at Kilwa or some of these other places on the East African coast, where we do have bodily remains. Have we found the sharpened teeth?
Yes, actually. I mean, the most striking example was found during an excavation by an English archaeologist named Neville Chittick. And he was excavating at Kilwa. Maybe I should show the map. And actually his assistants, sorry, I don't remember where I put maps. Okay. Well, anyway, at Kilwa, which you can kind of see here. So in a well was a skull found of an individual with sharpened teeth. And actually when the field hands found it, they stopped digging, and so he had to get a new crew. So it was dated actually by the excavation layers to, it wasn't exact, it was just before the 1300s. So that's not precise. But it's been found in context. And also we know from, say, Ibn Battuta's travels into Kilwa, in which he said that the Muslims of Kilwa were constantly waging war with the mainland people. He didn't give them a name, but he said they were cannibals with sharp teeth. And so this probably results from warfare, and a beheading was pretty common because you could prove someone's dead, right? So that's all we have so far. We don't have, unfortunately, a lot of archaeology of, say, Arabia for various reasons. That's historic, so that's medieval archaeology. So we have a lot of ancient, and you do find dental modification in ancient Arabia, but it's not so severe. It is thinning the teeth so that there are lots of spaces. So intentional modification. But hopefully, with time, we could do more. With Basra, there's almost no archaeology mostly because of the wars, right? So it's one of the most heavily mined areas in the world, landmines from the Iran-Iraq War, et cetera. So it's not even a space that we can do much in. So the spaces where we know probably the outskirts of the city. So unfortunately, that will have to wait. But I would hope that something more could come to kind of confirm these ideas, these migrations. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you for this fascinating talk. I wanted to ask a question about the date cultivation. Would they have been growing dates in East Africa, or do you think that's knowledge that was passed down among enslaved populations in Oman, like acquired locally? Like, where does the skill in the date cultivation come from?
Yeah, so date palms don't really grow in East Africa, so that would have been something. But coconut palms had come to East Africa before, from Indonesia before, the southern Indian Ocean beforehand. So where they would have learned that would have been in Basra. Also, date cultivation, as you can see maybe on this map, but in the southern coast of the Persian Gulf. So what's Baltina in Oman? So that was there. So it would have been learned in situ. Although there would have been new animals to learn too, but it seems that I'm not sure that they were placed because they knew so much about these animals and plants. But that is where they landed, and some of it did mimic their historical knowledge. Date palms do take a long time they take about 10 years to really grow to mature. So it's a real investment. But we know that in the meantime, because you don't tend date palms all year, is that these same individuals, I don't have a laptop or anything, but if you do a Google map search of Basra, and zoom in, and you go outside the city, you can actually still see the fields where, it sounds unbelievable, but where these 9th century slaves worked, and where they abandoned the fields in 868 to revolt against. It also shows just how unhospitable the climate and context is, that it hasn't been developed. But what you'll see are just deep trenches. So the black lines are deep trenches, and white lines are in the black mounds to the side. And what they were doing is, because the Tigris is a salty river, it continually salinates the soil around it. Date palms can grow in salty soil, but not much else can. So they were supposed to remove the salty top and then be able to grow wheat or cotton, and sometimes it was successful, sometimes it wasn't. But that's the work they did on the off-season of date cultivation, which was also very dangerous, right? People would climb and fall and die. So it was not something we would enjoy doing. So they had a lot of agrarian responsibilities, but that was one. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I was really curious about the tooth extraction as well, in part because so I've worked on sites in Morocco where Ibero-Maurusians do the exact opposite and extract the upper teeth. It's a hunter-gatherer society that's seeking to be like the sheep that they hunt. And I'm curious if there's any kind of interplay between desire to be like, not be like amongst pastoralists and hunter-gatherers in an East African context as well. But I was also just curious about whether any of these practices of bodily modification continue amongst enslaved communities once they've left these territories and been brought to the Middle East, and whether we know anything about attempts to restrict those practices.
That's a great question. I didn't know about the Moroccan. We'll talk about that a little bit. Why? So your group is trying to look like the animals they're hunting, and then the ones they don't want to look like the animals they care for. So I can't tell you why that particularly is. But again, it seems to redound through the centuries too. So that's also a pretty stable attitude towards the animals. As for, did enslaved peoples do this in the Middle East? They seem to have. Most of the slaves, and this is different from the US context and Caribbean context, but most of these slaves were children, were brought as children. And even the Arabic sources say, I was just saying date palms aren't grown in East. So they come with dates and they taste great, and they entice the children who would come onto the boats. And there's probably also, hedged against uprisings. I mean, we're talking prepubescent, children. So there's also that. Also, there were adults coming too, but the adults seemed to have continued the practice with the children and with the children they had. So the identification and the maintenance of this tradition seems to have been pretty important. So this is why also this 9th century author is asking, he's so curious because it must be a very visible, modification, right? I mean, you talk and you see it. I'm not sure I hit all your questions, so wait. That's okay, all right. But yeah, we could talk more about teeth. Anyone else have teeth questions? I guess that's a big one. Sorry, I should have spent more time on it. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. I mean, the Maasai gentleman I talked to, he thought he was very handsome because of it. So there's really a strong sense of beauty and aesthetics that still persists, right? That it's an ideal, right? And yeah, I don't know. I think. Do you see? I see hands.
No, one more. Thank you. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for your talk. This is not a teeth question, but I can certainly say I'll never look at my own teeth the same way. Thank you for the talk and the seasonal kind of structure. And a little bit further north of here, it's also sugaring season, which is another sign of spring, right? Yes. And so I have, if I may, two tree-related questions.
Okay.
One is on the manuscript illustration that you showed with the people working on the tree where they're wearing the hats and the shoes.
Right.
My first question is, what are they doing? Are they tapping the tree sap?
Yes.
Just basically, what are they doing? And then my second question is around trees like the baobab that have voyaged around so much. Are there similar or different kind of cultural practices around the tree? Does that change based on location, or is there continuity? Thank you.
No, those are great questions. First, for the balsam, I'm afraid to push this button. It might be a laser, but I don't want to end this. But if you see it, well, can you see the yellow stream? Is that clear? Okay. Okay. So they are tapping for sap. What the sap is used for, I'm embarrassed to say I haven't checked, but I know you didn't ask, but now I'm wondering. So probably medicinal purposes certainly, but you can see the knives in their hands to cut through the bark. As for how the trees were used in, say, Oman and the Yemen, and there are about 200 trees. I just showed you one, of course, but there may be at least 200. But as you can maybe divine from what I've said about the Wikipedia page, and if you're in Middle East history, you know this as well, that there's not a real deep discussion around the history of enslavement in Middle Eastern history. When it is written about, there's a focus on elite slaves, so the concubines of sultans, right? And so they had a great life. They had sherbet and they had servants, they were fine. But, and their children were free. And their partner recognized the child, right? So that didn't often happen with lower status women, who also, if their partners, masters would recognize the child, that child would be free, but often we know that they didn't recognize them. And so there are other sorts of, eunuchs who were heads of armies, and they had pretty decent lives all in all, other than the initial surgery. But from everyone else, there's not much around it. So there are other things I could have brought up. So what I'm saying, so the life of this tree, I don't know. I don't know much about it. Excavating it would be a little hard. You can see they've already put something around it, but this isn't the only example, and this isn't 1,000 years old, but they're older ones that might speak to these medieval populations. So what they do, I don't know, but I think there is sort of a compulsory Arabness in at least the countries I'm talking about here, in which basically to have any sort of social legibility or status, you don't really want to emphasize ethnic belonging, and you would emphasize your Muslimness and national identity, right? So you're moving away from those sorts of things. So it's hard to say exactly what this might have been used for. One last thing maybe. Well, one last thing I'll say related to trees, since you asked about trees, is that the bark and the leaves and the berry and the fruit, right, is edible of the baobab tree. I haven't found any, say, recipes related to any of these. I'm looking for that, actually. So that's one thing I want to pursue. It's possible this would be in the Cairo Geniza. It's possible. But anyway, so I want to look into maybe how this was used and maybe extrapolate from that and see how they learned how to use these plants, for instance. But good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. This was absolutely fascinating. I'm an art historian, so I'm very interested in your mention of East African ceramics that were found in the Middle East, you said. Yes. And I was wondering if there's any other evidence of a material record from these people themselves, since you use mostly Islamic sources, whether in the Arabian Peninsula or on the African continent.
Oh, sure. I mean, so this Tana, it's called Tana, the longer word that wouldn't fit on this, but it's Tana tradition ware ceramics. So they're pretty, I mean, you might say aesthetically, they're not spectacular. And so they've often been overlooked in collections as ordinary Indian water jars. There are also water jars in these spaces too, and also all along the East African coast. And so I mentioned Seth Priestman in London, and we're actually writing a grant together. He's a ceramicist, but to go back to these collections that have been stored in museums and to see if we can maybe pick out what were thought to be Indian water jars and figure out, where else in the Middle East for their East African ceramics. One shard has been found, it's not on this map, but in Siraf, which is in southern Iran, on the Persian Gulf. So around the Gulf, there seem to be again, it doesn't necessarily mean East Africans live there. There's a large possibility, but we can't really tell from that. And also what we want to do is work with archaeobotanists to see if there's, what's the word? Like a signature to see what kind of foods were actually cooked in these pots, right? So maybe from that as well, we could learn a bit more. You're asking where in East Africa these are found? Sorry. Material record. So far, no, but I don't. And as my colleague would say, though, it's mostly around lack of communication between these fields, meaning East African and Middle Eastern fields, and also just not knowing because they're not maybe as. I didn't have the Islamic ceramics are pretty. They're bright blue. They're pretty phenomenal, and they stand out in the dirt. These don't as much, so they don't really register. But as they're reconstructing the shapes and connecting them with these other East African pots, it's becoming clearer. But I guess I'd say it's pretty much in its infancy. I think Swahili archaeology, there may be 8 people around the world doing it actively. And so it's slow moving. So that's too bad. But we're trying to establish more connections with Middle Eastern scholars and see maybe how we can move this along a bit more and find out more about them. I think burials, as another audience member asked about, would also be very rich if we could have more archaeological human remains studies, but that's also hopefully to come. Thanks. No, thanks. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor, for a really wonderful talk. I was wondering if you could go back to the trees image.
Yes. This?
Oh, no, the manuscript illumination.
Sorry, okay.
No, yes. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it says there's one type of tree, and then it says another type, right? A secondary type of balsam, right? Yes. So what can we make of the sort of text-image interaction in which these trees look very similar to each other, but these Zanj guys, I mean, they're pretty cool, right? They know the different types of trees, right? They're like gaining different types of knowledge from two types of trees, right? Like that is to say, if our perspective is the perspective of an Islamic, a Muslim, presumably Arab reader, right, of this text, hey, look, these Zanj guys, they can tell the difference between these things.
No, this is Persian, but you're right. But you're right, the red is in Arabic. Is that what yes, okay. The red is in Arabic.
Red what I couldn't read was
okay. The black is in Persian. Okay, I think that I haven't read it myself, so I can't, like the black around it. So I can't really tell you what's there. But if you're asking maybe what the actual workers might have been able to figure out, where you find out more, this is just it's a text about materia medica, but in texts about, in Persian texts, especially on gyms and on pharmacology, you actually have discussion. I didn't talk about them. We can talk about them later. But they have discussions of what the East Africans know about them and how they use them. And they give the names in their languages. So even the Persian writers who seem to be the sailors and scientists who seem to be the ones traveling more to East Africa, not more, but engaging directly with the groups, the Zanj I'm talking about. So they traded directly for these woods and for like rhinoceros horn, and they give the local words for that. And they speak more about their knowledge. And again, I didn't talk about it today, but my sense is, and if you don't believe me, let's talk about it in private, because it's a little complicated, but that the Arab sailors, when they would come down, they were more of like, they hung out with the elites, that's why I didn't really talk about them. And they hung out with the chiefs and the priests and the medical, right, what do you call them? Traditional healers. And the Persians seem to have gone further south and traded directly with the people who had the hardwood. So we know in the Middle East, there's not hardwood really. It's palm trees, which are bindi, and bushes. So rich people wanted the hardwoods to build beautiful homes, right? And we know about that, teak homes and teak benches. So it's not here, but in Persian sources, they do get more into what these people knew. But it's there, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk, and I am familiar with some of your other work on literacy, which is my area. And I'm wondering, one of the previous questioners mentioned this, and it got me thinking, and again, this is not my area, so I'm not going to get the terminology right, bear with me, but I'm super curious. These African groups, are they leaving behind any kind of literary records of their own, anything in writing, whether it's everything from governmental records to literature to any kind of ownership marks? Is there anything that they have left about themselves?
You'd be surprised. And I think there's a lot of skepticism around this source, but there's a book, an Arabic book, and some of you already know this, Fakhr Sudan al Bidan, but it's what does that mean? The Boasts of the Blacks Over the Whites, right, by Al-Jahiz in the 9th century. And so Al-Jahiz himself, the sources say he had a black grandfather. That could mean his grandfather was from East Africa or from the southern Indian Ocean. It's not specified. And he never speaks about his own identity anyway. But he wrote a book in which he seems to interview, interviews too strong, but to speak with local East Africans. And he records a lot of things there about their sense of history. He records things about even like philosophical discussions and their lifestyles. And there's been a lot of skepticism about whether or not he really did speak with East Africans. But he's in Basra, which I did not say is referred to as a black city even in medieval sources. So geography texts will say, you can find black people in West Africa, East Africa, Southern Indian Ocean, and the city of Basra. So speaking to this very long and heavy history of slavery. And he says it's about maybe 20 pages. I mean, in print today. So it's not much, but it's actually, I could share it with you. It's been translated. It's actually quite interesting. So that's pretty much what we have. And that's mediated again through Jahiz's voice. As for autograph works, nothing yet, right? You can say nothing yet. But I hope to find that, yeah.
Love to know. I would love to know that source. Thank you so much. I'll connect with you later.
Okay, perfect.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions I could ask you, but I want to hear a little more about this practice of darkening skin.
Yeah.
You said you've read a few strange recipes, and I was curious if you had any more texts that explained how this worked, whether it was successful, whether it was a long-term change or an adoption of a new identity, anything at all.
Sure. Well, I'll give you the name of the source. It's the author's name is Al-Jawbari, and he lived in the 13th century in Syria. He claimed to be one of the travelers, to have lived with him for a long time, and I believe him. He actually reproduces a conversation in their language, which I worked on in another book, but so it seems authentic. The recipes, he has about 3, or 3 that I remember, let's say that, okay. And all I can remember, the only ingredient I remember is alum, but I have it at home, I can send it to anyone who wants to see it, but it seems to be fairly short term, long enough, and it's reapplied until you're out of, recognizable context where you're no longer recognized as an enslaved person. And you can fake something else, whatever, or remain with the travelers and travel with them. But it wasn't a long-term change. It was, So it was part of the tricks that these traveling people did. And again, for money, right? And people would save up the wages they might have gotten as enslaved people. Again, technically your wages, of course, belong to your master, but you could sometimes keep them for a bit. and pay people to escape. So, yeah, but I can share that. Oh, one last thing, Rachel Shine. I don't think she's here, she's coming later. And she's on my panel, of course, on Blackness on Saturday, but she works on blackface in the Islamic context, and she's looking at these recipes as, as examples of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, sure. Thanks. Drink.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation that opened our eyes to so many connections. I wonder if you've had a chance to study and think a little bit about the recent ancient DNA evidence showing the interaction of people from Asia, India, and Persia, particularly with people from Africa along the Swahili coast in the beginning of the intermarriage around 1000, and any thoughts you might have from your perspective of knowing the text so well on these developments.
That's a great question, and that was a fascinating article that came out in Nature. And so, as this gentleman just said, that it showed that by the year 1000 on the East African coast, that the maternal DNA was local. It was East African women, and the paternal DNA was Perso-Indian, which was fascinating. Also because it confirms Swahili oral tradition that says that they're descended from Persians. And historians and archaeologists have been pretty skeptical of that because you go to Zanzibar and everyone looks East African. And so the idea that there were any Persian ancestry was seen as an aspirational fiction. But it again confirms what they might have said. And these were elite burials, so all elite elite men in, I think, 7 cities along the coast. It actually, after I read that, then I went back to a source on accident, about a 9th century source. And I'm serious that my memory is fading. I don't remember, it'll come to me, but the author's name. And he writes in Arabic that the people of the Swahili coast were subject to the people of India. Not India, but Sindh. So what is today Pakistan. So it's a Perso-Indian territory on the cusp of, on the border of Iran and India. So it also seems to confirm the DNA evidence that it was at least known by the 800s that there was this interaction. I haven't really figured out everything happening on the Swahili coast, like the timing of all of it. I know when that port I was talking about, when it fell in 945, I didn't say that the attack was actually from people from Indonesia. So, I mean, it's a very complex the Arabs, Persians, Indians, and southern Indian Ocean isles. But you're right, that the Persian element has to come in. I think I don't have good Persian. I think that's my problem. I don't have great Persian. So I need to work with more, Arabic is more what I work with, but to help me get through the Persian sources to find more, because I think there's a lot actually, and the interactions are probably longer and more intimate. Yes, forming households, but also direct trade. So that's a place to go. So I need help if anyone's out there who wants to do this. Persian's pretty. It's Indo-European, that's pretty. Right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.